On the quiet streets of New York in the late 1970s, Joel David Rifkin appeared to live a life that was, by all outward appearances, ordinary. Born on November 17, 1959, Rifkin grew up in a suburban neighborhood of New York. His early life seemed unremarkable, a family that provided stability, access to education, and opportunities for social development. Yet beneath this seemingly normal upbringing, certain patterns of behavior began to emerge, patterns that, in hindsight, foreshadowed the dark path he would eventually follow. From a young age, Rifkin exhibited signs of social awkwardness and difficulty forming meaningful relationships. Friends and acquaintances would later describe him as quiet, reserved, and often withdrawn. He struggled to connect with peers, especially women, and often retreated into solitary pursuits. While such behavior could have been dismissed as typical adolescent introversion, it reflected a deeper sense of isolation and dissatisfaction with the world around him. Over time, these tendencies intensified, creating a psychological environment that would later contribute to his violent behavior. As Rifkin moved into adulthood, he attempted to navigate society in ways that outwardly appeared conventional. He took on jobs, pursued basic education, and maintained minimal social connections. However, his internal world was dominated by obsessive thoughts, anger, and a growing fixation on women, particularly those he perceived as vulnerable. These obsessions did not manifest immediately as violent behavior, but they set the stage for what would become a series of calculated, premeditated killings that would shock the nation. By the late 1980s, Rifkin began frequenting areas of New York known for prostitution and street-level vulnerability. Women in these areas were often marginalized, isolated, or living with limited social support. Rifkin saw in them not just victims but opportunities to exercise control, dominate, and act on violent impulses. He carefully observed his potential targets, noting their routines, vulnerabilities, and moments of solitude. Unlike impulsive criminals, Rifkin operated with a degree of patience and foresight that allowed him to strike without immediate detection. His early criminal behavior, while not yet escalating to murder, hinted at the capacity for violence. Rifkin engaged in minor thefts, voyeurism, and harassment, behaviors that, taken together, painted a picture of an individual struggling to assert control over his environment and the people in it. These actions were a prelude to more extreme violence, serving both as practice and as a means of satisfying a growing psychological compulsion. Rifkin's killings began quietly, almost imperceptibly. The first known victims were women he lured into situations where he could exercise control without interference. He would offer rides, companionship, or financial incentives, gradually lowering their defenses. Once isolated, he would commit acts of violence that were shocking in both their suddenness and brutality. While the specific details of each murder are disturbing, the pattern reveals a calculated approach. He targeted those least likely to be missed immediately, carefully planned the act, and took steps to conceal evidence afterward. A defining characteristic of Rifkin's method was the compartmentalization of his life. To outsiders, he appeared ordinary, attending work, interacting with neighbors, and maintaining social norms. To himself, he inhabited a private world where he exercised absolute control over life and death. In this hidden world, he carried out acts of violence, dismemberment, and concealment, all while presenting an outwardly normal appearance to the public. This duality, the coexistence of the ordinary and the monstrous, was central to his ability to evade detection for years. During this period, the city of New York began noticing an unsettling pattern. Women, often prostitutes or marginalized individuals, were disappearing under mysterious circumstances. While each disappearance was initially treated as an isolated case, investigators began to suspect a connection. Rifkin, aware of these investigations but confident in his meticulous methods, continued his killings. Each successful evasion reinforced his sense of invincibility, emboldening him to commit further crimes. Rifkin's psychological profile, reconstructed after his arrest, reveals a man who was both organized and detached. He demonstrated traits common among serial killers: social isolation, obsessive behavior, compulsive tendencies, and an alarming lack of empathy. Yet, unlike many impulsive killers, Rifkin planned his murders carefully. He selected victims, prepared the environment, and considered escape routes and evidence concealment. This calculated approach, combined with his ability to maintain a normal public persona, allowed him to operate undetected for several years. The years between 1989 and 1993 marked the height of Rifkin's criminal activity. Over this period, he killed at least 17 women, although some investigators believe the true number could be higher. His victims were primarily young women involved in prostitution, often living with minimal support systems. Rifkin's crimes were characterized not only by murder, but by the horrifying nature of post-mortem concealment. He frequently dismembered bodies and stored them in his apartment before eventually disposing of them in secluded areas, demonstrating both premeditation and cold calculation. Despite the mounting evidence, Rifkin's life continued to appear ordinary to those around him. Neighbors, co-workers, and even family members had no reason to suspect the existence of a hidden world where murder and dismemberment occurred. This juxtaposition, the banal daily life versus the extraordinary acts of violence, contributed to the shock that gripped the public when the truth was revealed. It also highlights the chilling capacity for human beings to hide malevolence behind a mask of normality. Rifkin's early murders were punctuated by close calls that could have led to his capture. In some instances, potential witnesses noticed suspicious behavior, yet either failed to act or could not link him to any specific crime. These narrow escapes only reinforced Rifkin's confidence, allowing him to continue killing while law enforcement struggled to piece together the fragmented evidence. By the early 1990s, law enforcement began to recognize patterns among the missing women. While many of the victims were transient or marginalized, investigators began to compile profiles and notice similarities in the circumstances surrounding their disappearances. Rifkin, however, remained elusive. His careful planning, methodical disposal of bodies, and ability to blend into society delayed his capture, allowing him to continue his spree and amplifying the eventual shock when the full scale of his crimes was revealed. The media began reporting on the growing number of missing women, often highlighting the vulnerabilities of marginalized populations. Families desperately searched for their loved ones, while communities were unsettled by the possibility of a serial predator operating in their midst. Law enforcement began coordinating across precincts, comparing notes, analyzing geographic patterns, and compiling evidence to link the disappearances. The process was slow, but gradually, a picture of an organized, meticulous, and dangerous killer emerged. Rifkin's psychological detachment allowed him to compartmentalize these violent acts from his outwardly normal existence. He planned each murder, each disposal, and each interaction to avoid detection. He was patient, methodical, and extraordinarily calculating, traits that would later shock criminologists and the public alike. By maintaining the facade of normalcy, he created an almost invisible presence, a predator living openly among those he preyed upon. As the first part of this story concludes, the foundations of Rifkin's crimes are clear. An isolated, socially awkward man with obsessive tendencies, preying on vulnerable women, killing with careful calculation, and exploiting societal and investigative gaps to remain undetected. The duality of his life, the meticulous planning of each murder, and the psychological depth of his detachment all set the stage for the escalation that would follow. The next part of the story will explore the intensification of his crimes, specific victim encounters, the methods of concealment and disposal, and the beginnings of law enforcement's increasing scrutiny that would eventually lead to his downfall. By the early 1990s, Joel Rifkin had evolved from a man with disturbing obsessions into a methodical, calculating serial killer whose crimes were escalating in both frequency and audacity. He had become adept at identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities in society, particularly among women who lived on the margins, prostitutes, runaways, and those without strong social support. These women were often overlooked, which made them tragically easy targets for someone like Rifkin, who was patient, observant, and chillingly meticulous in his methods. Every night, he prowled the streets of New York and surrounding areas, seeking opportunities while maintaining the illusion of normality in his day-to-day life. Rifkin's approach was psychological as well as physical. He relied on manipulation and charm to lure his victims, offering rides, companionship, or financial assistance. This strategy allowed him to isolate his victims without drawing attention. Unlike impulsive criminals, he studied the women he targeted, noting routines, behaviors, and vulnerabilities. Each encounter was carefully orchestrated, a disturbing testament to his ability to blend patience with predation. Over time, he became increasingly bold, confident that his meticulous planning would prevent discovery. Once he had a victim in his grasp, Rifkin's actions were coldly calculated. He often killed his victims in the confines of his own apartment, where he could control every variable. Afterward, he dismembered their bodies, storing them temporarily before transporting the remains to remote locations such as wooded areas, dumpsters, or abandoned properties. This method of disposal was systematic, reflecting both his foresight and his detachment from the human lives he ended. It allowed him to extend his spree for years, leaving law enforcement with fragmented evidence that was difficult to connect. Despite his growing audacity, Rifkin occasionally encountered moments of risk. Neighbors sometimes noticed suspicious activity, large bags carried late at night, or unfamiliar women entering his apartment. But these observations went unreported or unconnected to any broader pattern. These near misses reinforced Rifkin's belief in his invincibility, encouraging him to continue his spree while refining his methods. He developed a routine that balanced the banality of daily life with the horrific acts he committed in secret. To co-workers, family members, and casual acquaintances, he remained quiet, reserved, and outwardly ordinary. This contrast between appearance and reality was central to his ability to evade capture for so long. During this period, the city began to notice a disturbing trend. Missing persons reports, primarily concerning women in vulnerable situations, started to accumulate. Law enforcement faced challenges in connecting these disappearances due to the transient nature of many victims and the dispersed locations where they were last seen. Investigators began to suspect that a single perpetrator might be responsible, particularly after discovering patterns in victim profiles, methods, and geographic clustering. Despite these emerging connections, Rifkin's careful planning and ability to remain inconspicuous allowed him to continue killing without immediate consequence. Rifkin's psychological detachment was a defining element of his behavior. Unlike many impulsive offenders, he demonstrated organization, patience, and premeditation. He considered not only the act of murder but also the logistics of disposal, potential witnesses, and strategies to avoid detection. Each step, from selecting a victim to committing the murder, dismembering the body, and disposing of remains, was executed with methodical precision. This level of calculation made him both terrifying and exceptionally difficult to apprehend. Media coverage began amplifying public awareness of the growing crisis. Local news reported on missing women, particularly focusing on those involved in prostitution, highlighting both their vulnerability and the increasing sense of fear among families and communities. Public concern added pressure on law enforcement, prompting more coordinated investigative efforts. Police departments across jurisdictions began to collaborate, comparing case files, timelines, and geographic data to detect patterns that could lead to a single perpetrator. These early investigative steps, while slow, were crucial in setting the stage for Rifkin's eventual capture. As his crimes continued, Rifkin's audacity grew. He expanded his operational territory, sometimes traveling to neighboring counties or states to commit murders, testing the boundaries of his ability to evade detection. Each successful act reinforced his confidence, while each near miss, witnesses seeing him with a victim, the potential discovery of remains, sharpened his methods. He became highly skilled at manipulating both victims and public perception, maintaining a facade of normalcy while orchestrating acts of extreme violence. The body disposal methods Rifkin employed demonstrated not only planning, but also an understanding of forensic limitations at the time. He used plastic bags, boxes, and temporary storage within his apartment to delay discovery. Later, he transported remains to locations where the chances of discovery were low. This approach fragmented the evidence, making it difficult for law enforcement to connect the murders. Each disposal was a strategic decision aimed at minimizing risk while satisfying his compulsions. Law enforcement began piecing together the emerging pattern with increasing urgency. Investigators noted that most victims shared similar demographics and life circumstances. Forensic analysis began linking cases through subtle similarities in dismemberment patterns and disposal techniques. Witness reports and geographic profiling allowed authorities to focus on potential areas where the perpetrator might live or operate. Despite these advances, Rifkin remained elusive, blending into society while continuing his deadly activities. During this period, Rifkin also displayed his characteristic ability to compartmentalize. He could engage in mundane daily routines, working, shopping, interacting with neighbors, while maintaining a hidden world of violence within his apartment. This psychological separation allowed him to function socially and professionally, providing the outward appearance of a harmless man. Experts later noted that this level of compartmentalization is often seen in organized serial killers and represents a disturbing capacity for human beings to separate conscience from action. The escalation of Rifkin's crimes created a climate of fear within certain New York communities. Families of missing women grew desperate for information, and public anxiety increased as media coverage highlighted the potential presence of a serial killer. The growing number of disappearances, combined with emerging investigative patterns, set the stage for intensified law enforcement efforts. Each additional murder increased pressure on authorities to identify and apprehend the perpetrator. By the mid-1990s, Rifkin's network of crimes had created a complex web of evidence, much of it fragmented across locations and jurisdictions. Investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline of disappearances, cross-referencing missing persons reports with recovered remains and witness accounts. Geographic profiling suggested patterns in disposal sites and areas where victims were last seen. Although Rifkin remained at large, the meticulous work of law enforcement was gradually narrowing the gap between the perpetrator and capture. The psychology behind Rifkin's continued success is revealing. He relied on patience, observation, and premeditation, combined with a complete lack of empathy. Each victim was chosen carefully, each encounter manipulated to minimize resistance, and each disposal executed to avoid detection. Unlike impulsive killers, Rifkin approached murder as a calculated endeavor, and his ability to maintain an outwardly ordinary life made him uniquely difficult to detect. As Part 2 reaches its climax, the convergence of investigative diligence, public awareness, and Rifkin's growing audacity created the conditions for his eventual downfall. His pattern of behavior, once invisible in the complexity of urban life, began to leave traces too significant to ignore. The meticulous planning that had allowed him to evade capture for years also contained the seeds of his undoing. Each disposal, each murder, and each interaction with a victim created evidence that would, with persistence and forensic analysis, lead law enforcement to his door. The story of Joel Rifkin during this period is a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities present in society, particularly for marginalized populations. It also underscores the persistence of law enforcement, the importance of media awareness, and the role of forensic and investigative advancements in solving complex serial crimes. Rifkin's audacity, calculation, and psychological detachment created a reign of terror, but the eventual uncovering of patterns and evidence laid the groundwork for justice. By the mid-1990s, Joel Rifkin's carefully constructed world of evasion and violence began to unravel. While he had successfully carried out numerous murders over several years, the patterns he left behind were starting to form a trail that law enforcement could follow. His audacity had increased alongside his confidence, and it was precisely this growing boldness that would lead to the mistakes that ultimately exposed him. Each murder, each act of concealment, and each interaction with a victim had created evidence that, when combined with persistent police work, pointed directly to him. Rifkin's final known murders illustrate both his meticulous planning and his increasing recklessness. He continued targeting vulnerable women, often those involved in prostitution, selecting victims based on opportunity and perceived defenselessness. Each encounter followed his familiar pattern: approach, manipulation, isolation, and murder, followed by dismemberment and temporary storage. Yet by this stage, subtle errors began to creep into his behavior. He took greater risks with disposal locations, left behind evidence that could be traced, and occasionally exposed himself to observation, revealing cracks in his once flawless system of evasion. On one particular occasion, Rifkin engaged with a victim who would later play a critical role in his capture. The interaction seemed routine, following the same psychological manipulation and deceptive charm that had enabled him to carry out his previous murders. However, law enforcement had begun intensifying surveillance in areas where his victims were often last seen, and the network of missing persons reports, witness statements, and geographic analysis was growing more precise. Investigators had started focusing on individuals who fit the emerging profile of a calculated, organized serial killer operating in New York and neighboring counties. Rifkin, emboldened by years of evading capture, did not anticipate the narrowing of investigative focus. The convergence of forensic evidence and diligent police work eventually led authorities to Rifkin's apartment. Neighbors, who had occasionally noticed suspicious activity over the years, provided statements that, in hindsight, helped establish patterns of behavior. Investigators noted his repeated interactions with women who subsequently disappeared and combined these reports with geographic profiling, timelines of missing persons, and subtle forensic traces. These elements collectively narrowed the field, highlighting Rifkin as a primary suspect. The realization that the perpetrator could be someone living openly in the community underscored the duality that had defined his life: outward normality masking unspeakable violence. When law enforcement finally moved to apprehend him, Rifkin's ability to maintain his calm facade remained intact, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Investigators discovered remains stored in his apartment, alongside personal effects that linked him to numerous victims. The sheer quantity of bodies and the meticulous documentation by forensic teams revealed the scope of his crimes. Rifkin's methodical approach to murder and disposal had ensured his survival for years, but it had also created a tangible trail that could not be ignored. His careful planning had left behind the clues that ultimately led to justice. During interrogation, Rifkin's behavior exhibited the same chilling detachment observed throughout his criminal history. He provided details about his methods, his victims, and the circumstances of each murder with a calm, almost clinical demeanor. Psychologists analyzing his statements noted his lack of empathy, his ability to compartmentalize, and the way he described his actions in matter-of-fact terms. Rifkin appeared to regard the murders as tasks to be executed rather than crimes with human consequences, reinforcing the image of a highly organized and psychologically detached offender. The evidence collected from Rifkin's apartment and surrounding areas allowed prosecutors to build a comprehensive case. Each victim was linked to him through a combination of forensic analysis, witness statements, and the circumstantial evidence that had accumulated over years of meticulous investigation. The case highlighted both the brutality of his crimes and the persistence of law enforcement in connecting the disparate elements into a coherent narrative. The trial itself drew significant media attention, with the public and press following every detail of the proceedings, both horrified and fascinated by the extent of Rifkin's actions. Throughout the trial, the prosecution emphasized Rifkin's methodical planning, psychological manipulation, and the sheer number of lives affected by his actions. Defense attorneys attempted to provide context regarding his psychological profile and upbringing, but the overwhelming evidence and the clarity of his pattern left little room for mitigation. Families of victims attended the proceedings, seeking closure and justice for their lost loved ones. The courtroom became a stage where the full scope of Rifkin's crimes was revealed, not only in terms of numbers but also in the chilling detail of his methods and mindset. Ultimately, Rifkin was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, reflecting both the gravity of his offences and the societal imperative for justice. The sentencing marked the culmination of years of investigative work, the tireless efforts of law enforcement, and the painstaking collection of forensic evidence. Rifkin's conviction provided a sense of closure to many of the victims' families, though the emotional scars left by his actions would never fully heal. The aftermath of Rifkin's case had a profound impact on both criminal psychology and law enforcement practices. His crimes underscored the vulnerabilities of marginalized populations and the importance of coordinated investigative efforts across jurisdictions. Psychologists and criminologists studied his behavior, noting the combination of social isolation, obsessive tendencies, meticulous planning, and psychological detachment that enabled him to operate undetected for years. His case became a reference point for understanding organized serial killers and the methods by which they manipulate both victims and society to carry out their crimes. Public reaction to the case was a mixture of horror, fascination, and a renewed awareness of urban vulnerability. Communities reflected on the ways in which societal blind spots had allowed Rifkin to evade detection for so long. Media coverage, which had initially raised awareness of missing women, now chronicled the full extent of the killings, highlighting both the systemic challenges faced by law enforcement and the extraordinary nature of Rifkin's criminal activities. The case became a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that can exist even in seemingly ordinary neighborhoods. In the years following his conviction, Joel Rifkin remained in prison, where he lived under strict supervision due to the nature of his crimes. His story continued to be analyzed in criminal psychology, law enforcement training, and true crime documentation, offering insights into both the capabilities and the vulnerabilities of the human mind. Rifkin's ability to compartmentalize, plan, and manipulate illustrates a frightening aspect of criminal behavior: that extreme violence can coexist with outward normality, and that predators can operate hidden in plain sight for years before eventual discovery. The Joel Rifkin case also left a lasting legacy for victims' advocacy and urban safety programs. Awareness campaigns, educational efforts, and changes in investigative protocols were influenced by the lessons learned from the case. Law enforcement agencies placed greater emphasis on connecting missing persons cases, particularly for marginalized populations, and developing strategies for detecting patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity. Rifkin's crimes became a turning point in how authorities approach serial killings involving vulnerable communities, demonstrating the importance of vigilance, coordination, and forensic science. As we reflect on Joel Rifkin's story, it is clear that the case serves both as a chilling account of human depravity and as a testament to the perseverance of law enforcement. The duality of his life, the careful orchestration of violence, and the eventual unraveling of his crimes highlight the complex interplay between criminal ingenuity and investigative diligence. While the horror of his actions cannot be undone, the lessons learned continue to influence crime prevention, forensic investigation, and public awareness. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling,